Somewhere in southern Italy, buried under roughly 20 feet of ash and stone, there is a Roman street. It has stepping stones still crossing it, worn down by cartwheels and sandals. There are bakeries with ovens that still contain carbonized loaves of bread. There are houses with furniture, with paintings on the walls, with half-eaten meals left on tables. There is a city, frozen not in ice but in time, preserved by the very catastrophe that destroyed it. And for roughly 1,500 years nobody knew it was there. Not approximately where it was, not rumours of it, not legends, just nothing. An entire Roman town, erased so completely from living memory that the ground above it was farmed and built upon by people who had no idea what lay beneath their feet. That is the central strangeness of this story. Not just that Vesuvius erupted, which volcanoes do, not just that a city was buried, which has happened elsewhere, but that a thriving place, a town of somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people, with temples and theatres and taverns and politics and gossip and love affairs and street food, simply ceased to exist in the memory of the world. Pompeii was not lost the way a shipwreck is lost, gradually forgotten over generations. It was lost in a single afternoon in 79 AD, sealed beneath volcanic material so thoroughly that it waited in silence while empires rose and fell above it. And then it came back. Slowly, piece by piece, beginning in the 18th century, the city started talking again. Workers digging a canal broke through into painted rooms. Archaeologists carefully removed centuries of debris and found the street still laid out exactly as they had been. Bodies, or rather the spaces left by bodies, were still in the positions of their final moments. A dog curled beneath its chain, a man sheltering a child, a woman reaching for something she never reached. What Vesuvius did was brutal and absolute, but it was also, in a dark and unintended way, an act of preservation unlike anything else in the ancient world. Because ash, when it buries something fast enough and deep enough, doesn't rot it. It doesn't scatter it. It holds it still. Pompeii is, in some ways, the best preserved ordinary Roman town on earth, not because anyone tried to protect it, but because the mountain moved faster than memory. In this video, we're going to move through that whole arc. We'll start with the world Pompeii sat inside, the culture of Roman Campania, the particular rhythms of daily life in a prosperous harbour town in the 1st century. We'll walk through the homes and the markets and the places where people gathered to eat and argue and watch gladiators. And then we'll feel the ground shift. We'll follow the eruption hour by hour, the confusion of it, the sounds, the choices people made that saved them or didn't. And then we'll trace the long silence afterward, the rediscovery, the archaeology, and what this buried city still tells us about what it meant to be human 2,000 years ago. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, then welcome. That's exactly what this is for. And if you feel like it, leave a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is where you're listening. I genuinely read them, and there's something I find endlessly fascinating about the fact that right now someone might be hearing this in Rome at midnight, and someone else in Melbourne at breakfast, and someone in Chicago with the lights off at 2 a.m. A story about a lost city, crossing time zones quietly in the dark. It feels fitting somehow. Now, let's go back. Not 900,000 years this time, not to the edge of extinction, but to a warm and prosperous corner of the ancient Roman world, to a region called Campania, where the soil was impossibly rich, and the sea was close, and a mountain stood on the horizon that nobody thought was dangerous. Campania was, by almost any ancient measure, one of the most desirable places on earth to live. The Romans knew this. They wrote about it with the kind of enthusiasm that people usually reserve for places they've just discovered and can't stop talking about. Fertile land, a generous coastline, warm summers, markets full of goods from across the Mediterranean. If you had money in the 1st century AD and you wanted somewhere to spend it beautifully, Campania was where you went. The landscape itself was shaped by forces most of its residents didn't fully understand. The entire region sits on top of one of the most geologically active zones in Europe, a place where the African tectonic plate is slowly pressing northward beneath the Eurasian plate, crumpling the crust, forcing magma toward the surface. This process, over millions of years, had produced a coastline of extraordinary variety, cliffs dropping into clear water, bays curving in deep and sheltered, islands rising steeply from the sea, and everywhere the evidence of past eruptions not always recognized as such, but present in the dark volcanic soil that made the farmland so astonishingly productive. That soil is worth lingering on for a moment, because it explains so much. When a volcano erupts and the ash eventually settles and weathers over centuries, it breaks down into mineral-rich material that is almost impossibly good for growing things. The farmers of Campania had been working this land for generations, and they knew, even if they didn't know why, that crops here grew in a way they simply didn't elsewhere. Grapes especially. The wines of the region, particularly a variety grown on the slopes of the mountain itself, had a reputation across the Roman world. Pliny the Elder, who would later die watching Vesuvius erupt, wrote admiringly about Campanian wine. Merchants traded it as far as Gaul and North Africa. The vines climbed the hillsides in terraced rows, tended carefully, producing something that wealthy Romans were willing to pay well for. Beyond wine, the plain of Campania produced grain, olives, garum, the fermented fish sauce that was something like the ancient world's equivalent of a universal condiment, found in kitchens from Britain to Egypt. The towns of the bay were not just pleasant places to live, they were economically serious, nodes in a trading network that connected local agricultural production to the enormous appetite of the Roman Empire. The Bay of Naples anchored all of it. Geographically, the bay is almost perfectly shaped for maritime activity. It's wide enough to hold significant shipping traffic, sheltered enough to offer protection from the worst weather, and positioned on the Tyrrhenian coast in a way that made it a natural stopping point for vessels moving between Rome and the rest of the Mediterranean. The great port of Puteoli, just to the northwest, was for a long time one of the busiest harbours in the entire Roman world. Grain ships from Egypt came in there. Goods from the east passed through there. The road networks that connected the bay to Rome meant that wealth moved relatively quickly between the capital and the coast. Pompeii sat within this system in a particular and useful way. It was positioned near the mouth of the Sarno River, which gave it access to inland agricultural areas and allowed goods to move between the hinterland and the sea. The town had its own port, though it wasn't as large as Puteoli. It was close enough to Neapolis, the city we now call Naples, to benefit from that urban centre's connections, and close enough to Herculaneum, the smaller, wealthier town just to the northwest, to be part of a regional cluster of settlements that collectively represented a significant concentration of Roman prosperity. These weren't isolated communities. They shared roads, shared trade, shared political relationships, shared the same regional identity as Campanian towns, participating in the larger Roman world. Wealthy Romans came to the bay for reasons beyond commerce. They came to rest. The region had developed a reputation as a place for otium, the Roman concept of leisure and contemplative retirement from public life. Senators, generals, wealthy merchants built villas along the coast, places of deliberate beauty with views of the water and gardens designed to impress visitors. The Emperor Augustus had a particular attachment to the island of Capri, just at the southern edge of the bay. Tiberius essentially retired there. The coastline between Neapolis and Stabia was studded with these estates, some of them enormous, all of them signalling that their owners understood Campania as a place of pleasure and cultivation. And then there was the mountain. It stood on the northeastern edge of the bay, visible from nearly everywhere in the region, a familiar presence in the background of daily life. By 79 AD, Vesuvius didn't look like what we might imagine a dangerous volcano to look like. It had been quiet for so long that a forest had grown across its upper slopes. The summit was irregular, with a broad depression at the top that we now understand as a collapsed ancient caldera, but which probably looked, to people walking near it, like a natural bowl overgrown with vegetation. Spartacus and his enslaved followers had famously used that depression as a defensive refuge during the slave revolt more than a century earlier, rappelling down the outer slopes on ropes made from vines. That's how accessible and unthreatening the mountain seemed. There had been an earthquake in 62 AD, significant enough to damage buildings across the region, including in Pompeii and Herculaneum. But earthquakes were not uncommon in Campania. The geological restlessness of the region made itself felt periodically, and the residents seemed to have interpreted these events as earthquakes, not as warning signs of something volcanic. The mountain offered rich soil for the vines climbing its slopes. It offered a dramatic backdrop. It offered nothing, as far as anyone seems to have understood, that they needed to fear. That is the quiet irony at the heart of Campanian prosperity. The very processes that made the soil so rich, that built the dramatic coastline, that shaped this beautiful and productive landscape, were the same processes that had been slowly, over thousands of years, building pressure beneath the surface. Geography gave Campania everything, and geography was keeping a kind of account. Pompeii did not begin as a Roman town. That's worth understanding clearly, because by the time Vesuvius buried it, the city had already been through several lifetimes of change, accumulating layers of identity the way old buildings accumulate renovations. Its origins are somewhat contested among historians, but the evidence points to a settlement established by Oscan-speaking Italic peoples, possibly as early as the 7th or 6th century BC, in a location chosen with practical intelligence. The elevated lava plateau near the Sarno River offered defensibility, access to water, and a commanding position over nearby agricultural land and coastal trade routes. From the beginning, Pompeii was chosen because it made sense. Over the following centuries, the town passed through the gravitational pull of several dominant cultures. The Greeks, who had colonized much of southern Italy and established nearby Neapolis, left their influence in certain architectural forms and religious practices. The Etruscans, whose power extended into Campania during parts of the Archaic period, appear to have had some presence or influence in the region. The Samnites, the Oscan-speaking mountain peoples of the interior, controlled the town for a significant stretch of time and left a deep mark on its urban fabric. Many of the grandest houses that stood in Pompeii in 79 AD had their foundational structures laid during the Samnite period, when the town was prosperous and architecturally ambitious in its own right, before it ever became formally Roman. The transition to Roman control came through conflict. Pompeii joined the wrong side during the social war of the early 1st century BC, the revolt of Italian allies demanding full Roman citizenship. The Roman general Sulla besieged the town, and though the siege apparently failed to breach the walls, the aftermath of the war brought Pompeii firmly into Roman orbit. Around 80 BC, Sulla established a Roman colony there, planting a population of his veterans and their families alongside the existing residents. Latin became the dominant administrative language, though Oscan continued to appear in private inscriptions for some time afterward, a quiet reminder that the town's identity was layered and not simply overwritten. The physical city that emerged from this long history had the kind of complexity that real places accumulate. The walls surrounding Pompeii were substantial, built in volcanic stone, following an irregular perimeter that reflected the natural topography of the plateau, rather than any idealized geometric plan. Several gates punctuated these walls, each one a threshold between the organized interior and the roads stretching outward to other towns, to farms, to the port. The walls were already old by 79 AD, and repairs and modifications made over centuries were visible in their fabric, if you knew what to look for. They had served their defensive purpose in earlier conflicts. By the 1st century AD, they were more landmark than fortification, enclosing a town that had no serious expectation of siege. Inside those walls, the street grid was not perfectly regular. The oldest parts of the town in the southwestern section had a more organic layout reflecting pre-Roman development. The newer areas, particularly in the northern and eastern portions, showed the more deliberate grid planning that Roman colonial practice favoured. The result was a city of intersecting logics, older organic lanes giving way to straighter Roman streets, the whole thing paved in polygonal basalt blocks that have survived remarkably well. Stepping stones crossed many intersections at calibrated heights, allowing pedestrians to cross without stepping into the water, and waste that accumulated in the streets while leaving enough gap for cartwheels to pass between them. It's a small detail, but it suggests a town that had thought practically about how daily movement actually worked. The Forum occupied the southwestern part of the city and served as the gravitational centre of public life. It was a large open rectangular space, surrounded by colonnades, with temples, administrative buildings, and market structures arranged around its perimeter. The Temple of Jupiter dominated the northern end, positioned on an axis that aligned it with the Forum's central space, and, beyond the city walls, with the slopes of Vesuvius rising in the middle distance. Whether that alignment was intentional or coincidental, the effect was architectural theatre, the mountain framed at the end of a long processional view. Around the Forum stood the buildings of civic administration, the basilica where legal and commercial business was conducted, the buildings housing the elected magistrates who governed the town, the covered market for agricultural produce, the weights and measures office that regulated trade. The Forum was also where some of the most visible evidence of reconstruction could be found. The earthquake of 62 AD had caused serious damage, and 17 years later, when Vesuvius erupted, repair work was still visibly underway in several locations. Some temples were partially dismantled for renovation. Scaffolding had been in use. Building materials sat in storage. The Forum was not a polished, completed space, but a working one, mid-project, a town actively investing in its own future with no reason to think that future would be interrupted. Away from the Forum, the city's other major public structures were distributed across the urban fabric. There were 2 theatres, one large and open air with capacity for several thousand spectators, one smaller and roofed, probably used for musical performances and more intimate civic gatherings. There was an amphitheatre in the eastern part of the city, one of the oldest known stone amphitheatres in the Roman world, where gladiatorial games drew crowds from Pompeii and the surrounding region. There were 3 sets of public baths, each one a complex of heated rooms, cold plunges, changing rooms, and social spaces that served not just hygienic functions, but the broader Roman appetite for communal gathering. The baths were places to meet, to talk business, to be seen. They were, in a sense, the town's living rooms. The neighbourhoods that extended between these public monuments had their own textures and gradations. The wealthier houses clustered near the Forum and along certain favoured streets, their street-facing walls often blank and high, concealing interior courtyards and gardens of considerable elegance. The Roman house of the prosperous sort turned inward, presenting an unassuming exterior to the street while organising its interior around the atrium, with its central opening in the roof and a pool below to catch rainwater, and beyond that the peristyle garden, colonnaded and planted, a private landscape inside the city. These houses were being repaired, redecorated and expanded in 79 AD. Wall paintings were freshly applied in some rooms, others showed signs of ongoing renovation. Smaller dwellings filled in the spaces between, some of them genuinely modest, others comfortable in a more compact way. The city was not uniformly wealthy. It had its wealthy merchants, its old families with inherited property, its craftsmen and shopkeepers, its labourers and the enslaved people who moved through every level of the social hierarchy performing work of every kind. The evidence for all of these groups survives in the built environment, in the tools left in workshops, in the graffiti scratched into walls, in the arrangements of space that tell you something about who lived and worked where and on what terms. What strikes careful observers of the archaeological record is how thoroughly Pompeii was integrated into the Roman imperial system, while remaining, in important ways, its own particular place. It had its local aristocracy competing for civic magistracies in ways that replicated Roman political culture at a smaller scale. It had its connections to the wider world through trade, through the presence of people from across the empire, through the goods in its shops that had travelled from North Africa, from Spain, from the Eastern Mediterranean. But it also had its own local cults, its own particular concentrations of wealth and poverty, its own neighbourhood loyalties and street-level social geography. The frozen quality that people sometimes attribute to Pompeii, the idea of a city suspended in a single moment like a photograph, is a useful partial truth and a significant distortion. The Pompeii that the ash preserved was not a representative slice of Roman life, but a specific place at a specific moment, in the middle of ongoing change, full of contradictions and unfinished business. Buildings under repair, paintings still wet in some rooms, chipped and faded in others. A town that had been through difficult times and was actively working to improve itself. Not a museum, a living community that happened, one August morning, to run out of time. If you could have walked through Pompeii early on that last morning, before anyone realised it was their last, you would have stepped into a city already fully awake, not all at once but in layers. Behind the high, blank facades of the elite houses near the Forum, day began in a contained, almost ritual way. The household shrine, the lararium, often painted with bright images of protective spirits and snakes, might receive a quiet offering of wine or incense. The head of the household, the paterfamilias, was more than just a father. In Roman law he was the legal core of the family, the figure in whose name property was held, business conducted, marriages arranged. But in practical terms, in the kind of mid-sized town Pompeii was, his authority was constantly negotiated in the flow of ordinary life. In a large house, that ordinary life involved a surprising number of people. Family in the narrow sense, parents, children, perhaps grandparents, or a widowed relative, shared space with freedmen, enslaved workers and hired labourers. The architecture of these houses makes that social complexity visible. The front rooms around the atrium might be decorated with refined wall paintings, mythological scenes, delicate landscapes, or trompe-l'oeil architecture. Deeper in, around the peristyle garden, dining rooms opened to planted courtyards where fountains trickled and carefully tended shrubs gave an illusion of nature contained. But tucked away in corners, up narrow staircases, behind service doors, were cramped rooms with simple plaster, low ceilings, and few amenities. These were the spaces for servants and enslaved people, for storage, for the labour that kept the visible elegance functioning. Archaeologists find small, roughly finished rooms near kitchens, beneath stairways, above shops. In some, only a simple pallet would have fit. In more modest homes, often compressed into a couple of rooms fronting directly on the street, There was no such deep separation. A single family space might serve as sleeping area, workshop and dining room all at once. Some households lived above their workplaces, bakers above bakeries, fullers above workshops where cloth was cleaned and treated with pungent chemicals. Others rented an upstairs room above a shop owned by someone else. The city was full of these vertical combinations of work and life. Across these different kinds of dwellings, one of the most basic rhythms was dictated by food. Breakfast, such as it was, tended to be simple. Bread left from the previous day, maybe dipped in wine or spread with cheese or olives. For many people in Pompeii, much of what they ate was purchased rather than cooked at home. Not because kitchens were unknown, many houses had them, but because fuel was expensive, space was limited, and the city's street-level food economy was efficient. Along the busier streets, counters of thermopolia opened directly onto the sidewalk, their polished stone tops punctured by large jars set into the masonry. These would have held hot or cold foods, stews, beans, lentils, wine, sometimes more elaborate dishes. A person could stand at the counter, exchange a few coins and walk away with a portion of something warm and filling. In a town where many people lived in small spaces or upper floors without substantial cooking arrangements, this kind of street food was not a luxury. It was infrastructure. Bread was central. The massive stone bakeries scattered through the city make that clear. In these spaces, large rotary mills carved from volcanic stone ground grain into flour, turned by donkeys or mules that walked in endless circles, guided by enslaved or hired workers. The ovens themselves, beehive-shaped and built in brick, could bake hundreds of loaves at once. Carbonized bread rings, found intact in some ovens, tell us about shape and size. The presence of stamps on loaves suggests both commercial production and control over quality and distribution. Some households may have sent grain to a baker to be returned as bread, while others simply bought finished loaves. Wine was everywhere. Campania was famous in the Roman world for its vineyards. Amphorae from the region travelled widely. In Pompeii, wine was consumed not just by the wealthy at elaborate dinner parties, but by ordinary people at all hours, usually diluted with water, flavoured sometimes with herbs, honey or resin. The city's bars and taverns, which can be hard to distinguish archaeologically from simple food counters, offered wine by the cup. Graffiti scratched on their walls, complaints, jokes, declarations of love, suggest that these were social hubs as much as sources of calories. Another flavour was particularly characteristic of the region: garum, the fermented fish sauce that Romans used the way many modern cuisines use soy sauce or fish sauce today. Production sites near Pompeii processed fish and salt in vats, allowing them to ferment before drawing off the liquid. Amphorae stamped with maker's marks show that garum was not just for local use. It was a branded commodity shipped across the empire. In Pompeian kitchens, its sharp, salty taste would have seasoned everything from vegetables to meats, blending with herbs, oil and wine to create complex flavours that modern recreations only approximate. Behind these meals, visible and invisible, was work. Household labour in Pompeii, as in much of the Roman world, was structured around a combination of family members, slaves and freed people. Enslaved individuals might be purchased, inherited or born into the household. Some worked in domestic service, some in workshops, some in the fields outside town. Freedom was possible. Manumitted slaves became freedmen or freed women, often maintaining obligations to their former owners as clients, while pursuing their own trades or businesses. In Pompeii, inscriptions on tombs and building fronts record freedmen who rose to significant prosperity, owning shops, sponsoring public works, even holding local magistracies in some cases. This brings us to the social fabric that tied the town together: patronage. A wealthy citizen might have a circle of clients, poorer freeborn people, freedmen, sometimes even modestly prosperous tradesmen, who visited his house in the morning to pay their respects and in return received favours, introductions, or small stipends. This daily ritual, the salutatio, is better documented in Rome than in Pompeii, but the presence of large reception spaces in many elite houses and the local political competition seen in inscriptions suggest that similar patterns were at play. These ties of patron and client shaped access to work, legal protection, and social advancement. The rhythm of the day flowed outward from the home into the streets, workshops, and fields. Craftsmen rose early to open their doors, metal workers, textile dyers, carpenters, lamp makers, painters, shoemakers, fulleries, where cloth was washed, bleached, and finished using water, clay, and sometimes ammonia from urine, left behind vats and basins that still line certain courtyards. The smell must have been intense. To live in Pompeii was to live in close proximity not just to your neighbours, but to the sounds and odours of constant production. Women's work, some of it visible in the archaeological record, some of it inferred, range from running small shops and managing household accounts to spinning, weaving, and supervising domestic staff. Legal and social norms limited women's formal political roles, but inscriptions show them as property owners, donors to public buildings, and participants in business. Children move through this environment in ways the evidence only briefly reveals. Small shoes, toys, graffiti with shaky letters practicing the alphabet. Rest was not absent from this schedule, but it had its own logic. The heat of the midday sun could make work uncomfortable. Some activity shifted to the early morning and late afternoon. The public baths, with their carefully managed sequences of warm, hot, and cold rooms, were busiest later in the day, when men and, in some bath complexes at different hours, women came to wash, socialise, and linger. Evenings might bring more elaborate meals in wealthier houses, dinners where guests reclined on couches around a central table, courses served in a particular order, conversation flowing under painted ceilings. For others, the evening meal was simple and quick, a bowl of something purchased from a shop, eaten near the doorway as traffic thinned and oil lamps flickered to life. Taken together, the artefacts and spaces of Pompeii, the shrines in corners of courtyards, the carbonized loaves still in ovens, the worn steps leading to cramped upper rooms, the graffiti recording debts and affections, show a city saturated with ordinary habit. People woke, ate, worked, negotiated obligations, cared for children, worried about money, planned repairs, argued, celebrated small festivals. They moved along routes so familiar they probably walked them without thinking, and that is where the contrast becomes quietly stark. Because all of these routines, so deeply practiced as to feel permanent, were being followed on the very morning when ash began to fall. The ovens were still warm, the mill still turned, wine was being poured, perhaps watered for breakfast. The same patterns that had repeated for years, adjusted bit by bit after the earthquake of 62, unfolded one more time, unaware that before the day ended, the city that had made such practical sense for centuries would be smothered, and these ordinary acts would become the final traces by which we would come to know them. If you kept walking with those early risers, away from the quiet courtyards and into the streets, you'd feel another layer of the city coming fully into focus, the world where money changed hands, where people met in public, where Pompeii became not just a collection of homes but an economy, a stage, and a conversation. On almost every block, the line between house and shop blurred. A grand residence might have a formal entrance reserved for guests, but its street front could be perforated with narrow doorways leading to rental units. Some were simple one-room spaces, a counter and a back shelf. Others opened into deeper workshops. The facade that looked like private wealth from one angle became a strip of small-scale capitalism from another. Shops sold what you would expect: bread, wine, oil, cloth, lamps, pottery, and what is harder to see directly: services, repairs, arrangements of credit. Counters worn smooth by years of elbows show where people lean to talk, to haggle, to wait for change measured in small bronze coins. In some workshops, archaeologists find weights and scales, suggesting that price and quantity were constantly negotiated. In others, half-finished goods freeze a moment of workflow: a pot partway fired, a wall only partly painted, a metal object still needing polish. Industrial activity, on Pompeian terms, was folded right into the urban fabric. The fullers you encountered in the previous section were not on some distant edge of town. Their vats for washing and treating cloth occupied central courtyards and ground floors on busy streets. Textile production, dyeing and finishing seemed to have been major local industries. The famous House of the Vetii, an elite residence with lavish wall paintings, opens onto a fullery. The same property could be both refined domestic space and working business. Status and commerce did not always separate neatly. Bakeries, too, worked at a scale that went beyond a single household. Their mills and ovens sit along thoroughfares where carts could deliver grain and carry away bread. Some bear the names of proprietors stamped into bricks or painted on the walls, partnerships between freeborn citizens and freedmen, arrangements that tied economic opportunity to social mobility. A freedman who had earned his liberty through service might invest in a bakery or a workshop, using skills and connections gained under slavery to build an independent livelihood. The city's walls preserve traces of these trajectories: election notices recommending candidates who proudly identify themselves as freedmen, suggesting that economic success could tilt into local influence. Bars and taverns, which could be hard to distinguish from food shops at first glance, were nodes of another kind of business. Wine by the cup, sometimes mixed on the spot from large jars sunk into the counter, created a setting where news and gossip circulated. Some places had small back rooms, perhaps for more private drinking or for sex work. The line between tavern and brothel is sometimes clear. A building dedicated entirely to sex work, with explicit paintings and a row of small rooms, has become famous. But often it was probably porous. Space in Pompeii was used flexibly. The same counter might serve workers grabbing lunch at midday, gamblers in the afternoon, and men seeking different forms of pleasure at night. Beyond these small shops, a wider network of trade threaded through the town. Amphorae from other regions show that Pompeii imported wine as well as exporting it. Oil from Spain or North Africa, fine tableware from Gaul, luxury goods from the eastern Mediterranean moved through warehouses and storerooms. The harbour at nearby Puteoli handled the huge flows of grain and goods linking Italy to the wider empire, but Pompeii, with its own access to the sea, participated in a more local web, shipping garum, wine, and agricultural products, receiving what its citizens could not produce. If business gave the city its hum, pleasure and public ritual gave it its pulse. One of the most characteristic institutions of Roman urban life was the bath. Pompeii had several bath complexes, some modest, some more elaborate, where people of many social layers came together. Entrance fees were low enough for ordinary citizens. Enslaved people might accompany their owners. Inside, the sequence of rooms, apoditerium, tepidarium, caldarium, was more than hygiene. It was a kind of social choreography. Bodies were washed, but reputations were also displayed and maintained. Men might discuss politics in the warm room, reclined on benches among painted walls and vaulted ceilings. Deals were probably struck there as often as in formal offices. Entertainment in a stricter sense clustered in specific buildings. The amphitheatre, one of the oldest known in the Roman world, could hold thousands. Here gladiatorial games and animal hunts turned violence into spectacle. Seating was arranged by status. Local elites funded events to win favour and display generosity. Inscriptions record a famous riot between Pompeians and spectators from a neighbouring town during one set of games, a reminder that pleasure and rivalry often went hand in hand. Nearby, the theatres hosted plays, mimes and musical performances. In seasonal festivals, the boundary between actor and audience blurred. Religious celebrations might spill from temples into streets, combining processions, sacrifices, feasts and performances. The gods worshipped in Pompeii range from long-established Roman deities to local and imported cults. The Temple of Apollo, the Sanctuary of Venus, shrines to the imperial family, the cult of Isis, all had their spaces. Religion here was not a private matter of belief, but a public fabric of rituals, images and offerings that tied the town into the empire's larger order. Politics, too, lived outdoors. The Forum, with its colonnades and administrative buildings, was the nerve centre of public life. Here, magistrates sat on raised platforms to hear cases, oversee markets, and perform rituals. But the Forum's stones also carried messages. Election notices painted in bold letters on walls and pilasters urged voters to support one candidate or another for local office. These ads often appeal to specific groups. The fruit sellers ask for, the fullers back, neighbours of this district support, suggesting that occupational and neighbourhood identities translated directly into political blocks. The style of these notices tells us something about tone as well as structure. Many are formulaic and respectful. Some are enthusiastic, maybe the work of friends or clients eager to be seen endorsing the right name. Even these painted slogans, hurriedly brushed on plaster, were part of the daily visual environment. Residents of Pompeii literally walked past politics every time they went to buy bread or visit a temple. And then there was the more intimate layer of writing, graffiti. On walls, door jambs, columns, and inside houses, people scratched brief messages into fresh or aging plaster. Love notes, insults, boasts, fragments of poetry, price lists, rude drawings. Some mark victories in games. I was here and I won. Others record affection. Restituta, take good care of yourself. Some are jokes at the expense of tavern owners complaining about watered wine. Others are unexpectedly tender, like the line that reads, in careful Latin, "Health to you whoever loves, and may you prosper who has loved." These casual inscriptions capture registers of language that formal literature rarely preserves. They show misspellings, nicknames, bilingual puns, school exercises, attempts at sophistication. They mention debts, wages, business deals, religious sentiments. Together, they make clear that literacy in Pompeii was not confined to a narrow elite. Even if many people could only read and write a little, that little was enough to leave traces of their humour, frustration, hope. If you hold all of this in view at once, the shops and workshops, the baths and amphitheatre, the temples and the forum, the election slogans and the scratched declarations of love, the streets of Pompeii stop feeling like museum corridors and start feeling crowded again. You can imagine the sound, the clatter of iron-shod wheels over paving stones, the calls of street vendors, the clink of tools in a bronze workshop, the chant of a procession turning a corner. You can picture the mix of people, wealthy citizens in carefully arranged togas, freedmen in more practical garments, women carrying baskets or ledgers, children darting between adults, enslaved porters balancing loads, foreign merchants speaking accented Latin or other languages entirely. At certain crossroads, shrines to the household and street gods watched over this flow, their painted snakes and offerings of fruit tying the small scale of a block to the larger cosmos. Public life in Pompeii was not just the domain of monuments. It happened at thresholds, at counters, in bath-changing rooms, on theatre steps, under election posters, beside graffiti scratched at eye level. The city's stone and plaster, preserved under ash, hold more than architecture. They hold a record of movement and mixing, of business and pleasure overlapping hour by hour. And all of that, the daily negotiations over price and status, the shared laughter in taverns, the murmured prayers in sanctuaries, the quick strokes of a stylus carving a private joke into a public wall, continued right up to the day when the sky began to change, when the signs that had long been sleeping beneath the mountain finally started to surface. The mountain had always been there. From the streets and rooftops of Pompeii, Vesuvius rose as a steady presence on the skyline, a dark, sloping shape behind the vineyards and villas. It did not smoke, it did not glow. To the people who lived around its base, it was not a threat. It was part of the background of their lives, like the sea or the sky. But beneath that calm outline, the ground had already spoken once. 17 years before the final disaster, in the year 62, an earthquake struck the Bay of Naples with extraordinary violence. Ancient writers describe buildings collapsing, livestock dying, and towns across Campania badly damaged. Pompeii, so close to the source, must have shaken terribly. Walls split, columns toppled, roofs crashed down in clouds of dust and broken tile. Interiors that had seemed solid the day before suddenly opened up to the sky. In our own time, we know that such quakes are often connected to volcanic systems, stress adjustments along faults that run beneath mountains like Vesuvius. The Romans had no such framework. For them, earthquakes were signs, but not necessarily geological ones. They might be interpreted as omens from the gods, portents of divine displeasure, or simply as one more unpredictable blow of fate in a world where storms, plagues, and fires were all part of the accepted order of things. What they knew, practically, was that life had to continue. If you walk through Pompeii's ruins today, you can still see the scars of that quake and the attempts to heal them. Some houses show careful, expensive repair work. New walls in neat stone, fresh plaster laid over cracks. Others display cheaper fixes, rougher masonry plugging holes where finer ashlar once stood. Wooden supports propping up weakened structures, courtyards partly abandoned, their damaged wings walled off rather than restored. Temples, too, bear these traces. The great temple of Jupiter at the northern end of the Forum shows evidence of repair campaigns still underway when the ash fell. Columns dismantled, foundations exposed, architectural pieces stacked for reuse. The Forum itself, the civic heart of the town, looks in places like a construction site frozen mid-project. It suggests a city that was not simply restored and finished after 62, but one that had been living inside its own rebuilding process for years. By 79, when Vesuvius erupted, Pompeii was still, in many corners, a work in progress. That alone tells us something about the scale of the earlier damage and the rhythm of recovery. Wealthy property owners reused decorative materials from collapsed structures in more modest ways. Elaborate colonnades might be replaced with plain walls. Public buildings, dependent on collective funding and political will, were slower to repair than private houses where an owner had clear incentive to act. Some plots, especially near the edges of town, seem to have been left partially ruined, their fallen stones quietly settling into weeds. Yet life did not pause while masonry was patched. New frescoes were painted beside older, cracked ones. New businesses opened in ground floors where upper stories were still missing. Election notices were painted over incomplete repairs. The town, like a person recovering from an injury, learned to move again even before it had fully healed. In that world, tremors were not unexpected. They were reminders of an earlier trauma, but also perhaps familiar enough to be absorbed. Ancient sources suggest that after 62, quakes continued to trouble the region. Minor tremors rattling dishes, startling animals, loosening plaster. Occasional stronger shocks that might send tiles sliding or reopen old cracks. For a generation that had survived the Great Earthquake, such movements could be frightening, but they were also part of the new normal. Roman writers did discuss earthquakes in more general terms. Some believe they were caused by winds trapped in underground cavities, rushing and tearing at the earth until it shuddered. Others imagined vast subterranean fires or shifting balances of air and water. These ideas were attempts to grapple with phenomena that were felt but never seen directly. None of them framed earthquakes as warnings of volcanic eruption in the modern sense, though a few observers did note that some regions with fiery mountains were also prone to shaking. In a place like Campania, where volcanic landscapes had long since cooled, it's unlikely most residents thought of Vesuvius as anything but a mountain. Some did know that the region was geologically unusual. The nearby Phlegrean fields had fumaroles and hot springs that ancient writers connected to the mythic underworld. But that was several miles away, an area with its own legends. Vesuvius, by contrast, grew vines. We cannot reconstruct precisely what people in Pompeii thought when the ground moved in the years and months before 79. We can only place a few pieces. One ancient account written after the disaster hints that in the days leading up to the eruption, the area experienced a series of small quakes. Nothing, the author says, that greatly alarmed people who were accustomed to such events in Campania. That phrase, accustomed to such events, carries a quiet weight. It suggests that by then, shaking was not an extraordinary sign but a background risk, like living near a river that sometimes floods. Other possible warnings have been suggested by modern scholars. Springs might have shifted or temporarily dried as groundwater pathways changed. Wells might have tasted different. Animals might have behaved strangely. In the harbour, fluctuations in the sea level or unusual waves could have been noticed by sailors and dock workers, but our evidence for any of this is indirect, inferred from what we know of other eruptions and from the general behaviour of volcanic systems. What we can say is that, if such signs occurred, they would have been filtered through local experience. A sudden drying of a spring might be read as a sign from a particular deity, calling for additional offerings. A sequence of tremors might prompt nervous jokes in a tavern, a brisk trade in superstitious charms, a few families deciding to spend some time with relatives in the countryside. But there is no indication of a mass exodus. No layer of abandonment preceding the ash. People stayed. Part of the reason is timing. Volcanic unrest can simmer for years or flare in a matter of days. It may produce dramatic, unmistakable precursors or remain deceptively quiet. Vesuvius on that last summer seems to have kept its most decisive signal for the morning it finally burst open. Part of the reason is human psychology. When a danger has not yet fully revealed itself, when its past manifestations have been survivable, it is easy to explain it away. To treat the latest tremor as another entry in a familiar pattern. To assume that what has always been background will remain background. So, the work went on. Bakers ground grain. Painters mixed pigments to cover old cracks. Children played in streets where scaffolding leaned against half-repaired walls. At night, people might have lain awake for a moment when their beds shivered, listening to tiles rattle, then drifted back to sleep when the motion stopped. The mountain loomed where it always had, its slopes terraced with vines and dotted with farms. These signs, if they were there, were ordinary enough to fold into daily life. The warning, such as it was, lay mostly in the memory of 62, in the knowledge that the earth beneath Pompeii could move with terrifying force. But memories fade. New generations grow up with their parents' stories as something halfway between fact and legend. And Vesuvius, silent and generous with its fertile soils, gave little hint that it was more than a mountain, until the day it woke. The traditional date for that awakening is precise. Ancient chroniclers, copying each other over centuries, gave it as the 24th of August in the year 79. For a long time, historians treated that day as fixed. It fit the idea of a sudden summer catastrophe, a blazing Italian August in which the sky darkened at noon and the grapes withered under falling ash. Then, slowly, details began to trouble that picture. Excavators at Pompeii and nearby villas found braziers lit indoors, suggesting cooler weather. Amphorae with labels from the year's wine harvest hinted that pressing had already begun, something more likely in autumn than in high summer. Charred remains of fruits, pomegranates, walnuts, late figs, looked like produce ripened in the later part of the year. Even Pliny the Younger, our main eyewitness, exists in different manuscript traditions, some giving the date in August, others in a month closer to our October. Modern scholars now often argue for a later date, sometime in early autumn. But the evidence is not absolutely decisive. Manuscripts can be miscopied. Agricultural practices varied by region and year. The precise day, whether in August or October, slides around a little when we push it too hard. What seems clear is the season. The eruption came after the main heat of summer, when the air by the Bay of Naples could already have had the faint coolness of the turning year. Vines heavy with grapes, fields in various stages of harvest, a time when people were thinking about storage, about winter, about the cycle beginning again. Instead, another, far older cycle was about to assert itself. Sometime in the late morning, perhaps around midday, Vesuvius did something no living person in Campania had ever seen it do. Pliny, writing from the safety of distance a couple of decades later, describes his first awareness not as a roar or a flash, but as a sight. His mother, he says, drew his attention to a cloud of unusual size and shape rising above the mountain. It didn't look like ordinary weather. It was taller, more defined, and it held itself in the sky in a way that made people stop and stare. He likens it to a pine tree, a tall narrow trunk of darkness rising into the air, then spreading at the top into branches. That image is so vivid that volcanologists still use the term Plinian eruption to describe events of that scale. In modern terms, we think Vesuvius blasted a column of gas, ash and pulverized rock high into the atmosphere, perhaps 20 kilometers or more. At its base near the summit, vents that had been sealed for thousands of years tore open. Magma, suddenly depressurized, turned water into steam with explosive violence. Solid rock shattered into tiny shards. The mountain began to unbuild itself from the inside out, flinging its own substance into the sky. For those in Pompeii, the first minutes may have been strangely quiet. The town lay not right under the summit, but some distance away, across fields and orchards. At first there was only the column, dark against the sky, thinning at its edges, climbing higher and higher in a way that no storm ever did. People would have shaded their eyes, stepped out of shops, called others to come look. There might have been nervous laughter, temple doors suddenly more crowded, a flurry of small offerings. Then the sound would have arrived, a deep, rolling thunder that did not fade the way a storm's rumble did, but went on and on, crashes like distant artillery, the sense, not just of noise, but of something large and invisible grinding. Pliny, across the bay at Misenum, felt the ground shake. Walls trembled. The sea drew back and surged in strange ways. In Pompeii, closer to the source, the vibrations would have been stronger. Dust sifted from ceilings. Tiles rattled. Animals brayed and tried to bolt. But the most dangerous part of the first phase did not come from the ground. It came from above. The towering eruption column could not support its own weight forever. As it rose, heavier fragments began to fall out. Pumice, light, porous rock, full of bubbles, started to rain down on the slopes of Vesuvius and the surrounding countryside. Pumice is stone, but it falls like a hail of hardened bread crusts, light enough to float in water, heavy enough to hurt when it slams into a roof tile at speed. At first, the stones were probably small, pebbles, then fist-sized pieces. They bounced in streets, rattled on tiles, thudded into courtyards. White pumice in some areas, grey in others, depending on the chemistry of the magma. This was the moment when the mountain stopped being an odd sight and became an unfolding catastrophe. A quiet drizzle of stones might have been tolerable, but the fall thickened. The spaces between impact shrank. Roofs, especially the broad, flat ones and those covered in heavy accumulations of earlier debris, began to collect layers of pumice. The weight built up hour by hour. Terracotta tiles, never designed to hold tons of loose rock, started to flex and crack. Ash, finer than pumice, sifted down with it. A grey powder like powdered glass, catching in hair, eyes, lungs. It gathered in corners, in folds of clothing, in half-hidden spaces. Breathing became harder. People wrapped cloths around their mouths, whether out of instinct or because someone remembered advice for dust storms. Voices became muffled. The familiar air of Pompeii thickened into something grainy and abrasive. Pliny speaks of the darkness that followed, a darkness deeper than any moonless night, even though it began while the sun was still high. The eruption column spreading out like that pine tree's crown cast a vast shadow. Ash clouds billowed and rolled, turning day into an unreal twilight. In that gloom, the constant patter and crash of falling debris must have felt surreal, like being inside a storm that rained stones instead of water. We know from the archaeological layers that this pumice fall lasted for many hours. Some estimates suggest 7, 8, perhaps more. It laid down meters of material in and around Pompeii, filling courtyards, blocking doorways, slowly transforming streets into trenches between rising banks of rock. For the people below, time during those hours must have stretched strangely. Some tried to shelter indoors, trusting their houses more than the open streets. Others, perhaps hearing timbers groan above them, decided to flee, making their way through lanes where the pumice already reached their ankles, then their calves. Each step became harder as the loose, shifting stones slid underfoot, like trying to wade uphill through a river made of gravel. Pliny's testimony, valuable as it is, hardly mentions Pompeii itself. He writes from Misenum, where his uncle, Pliny the Elder, organized ships to investigate and to help. His letters are full of his own family's experience, the shaking of the buildings, the confusion on the shore, the creeping panic as day vanished. He reports what he can, but he did not see the roofs of Pompeii sag under their newfound burden, or hear from within the city the specific pattern of cries and crashes. We infer those details from the silent record. Collapsed upper stories, skeletons found under fallen beams, streets choked unevenly with pumice where walls broke and let in later flows. Pliny gives us the outline. The archaeology fills in some of the texture. Between them lies a gap that no source can entirely bridge. What we can say is that sometime during those first hours, the mental image of Vesuvius for the people of Pompeii changed forever. It was no longer the green mountain behind the vineyards, no longer the source of fertile soils or the distant backdrop to forum speeches and market days. It had revealed itself as something else entirely, a vent into the deep earth, a place where forces beyond civic life, beyond law and custom were breaking through. The mountain had awakened, and it was still only in its first breath. In that first breath, people still had choices. The pumice was falling, the ash was thickening, but for a while the streets of Pompeii were not yet impassable. Doors still opened, gates still swung, animals could be led, children carried, bundles shouldered. The disaster had begun, yet it had not closed in completely. Different households would have read the same signs in different ways. Some, especially those in sturdier homes with inward-sloping roofs and central courtyards, may have decided to wait it out. Earthquakes were frightening, but Campania was used to tremors. Strange clouds were alarming, but storms could be survived behind thick walls. A rain of stones was new, but roofs had seen heavy downpours and autumn hail. In those first hours, staying inside, shuttering windows and waiting for the storm to pass might have felt like the cautious, sensible choice. Others, perhaps closer to the falling column's path or in houses where tiles had already begun to crack, would have felt the danger descending quite literally above their heads. The percussion of pumice on roof tiles, first random, then nearly continuous, would have carried a message of its own. Beams creaked. Dust billowed from the join between wall and ceiling. In some rooms, hairline fractures crept like spiderwebs across plaster. In those places, fear would have pushed people toward the streets. Archaeologists find evidence of both instincts written into the city's final moments. Some victims lie in ground-floor rooms close to doorways, as if they had huddled there for safety. Others cluster near thresholds that never opened, their escape perhaps blocked by piles of stone and collapsed timber outside. Still others are found far out along the roads that lead away from the walls, motion frozen in what was clearly an attempt to flee. Under the darkening sky, decisions crystallized. To leave meant stepping into an environment that was rapidly turning alien. The light faded as the eruption column spread and ash clouds rolled overhead. Pliny, across the bay, speaks of the sun being blotted out so thoroughly that people could barely recognize each other. In Pompeii, nearer the heart of the shadow, that twilight must have arrived even sooner. Imagine trying to judge distance and direction when the familiar landmarks of your town were veiled in dust and half-light. The Forum, usually open and bright, became a basin where ash settled. Colonnades that once cast straight, sharp shadows now disappeared into diffuse gloom. The line of the distant sea, normally a constant point of orientation, vanished entirely behind the opaque curtain of falling debris. The sounds, too, would have made clear thinking difficult. There was the continuous, irregular drumming of pumice on every surface, the heavier clatter of larger blocks striking tiles and breaking them, the low, endless growl from the mountain itself, punctuated by sharper detonations as vents shifted or parts of the column collapsed and reformed. Through it all ran nearer, more human noises, shouted instructions, sobbing, the panicked braying of donkeys, the barking of dogs that could smell something in the air their owners could not yet name. Breathing grew steadily harder. Ash is not like ordinary dust. It is composed of tiny, jagged fragments of glass and pulverized rock. In a dense fall, each inhalation draws this abrasive powder into the nose, mouth, and throat. People would have coughed, spat grey, wrapped shawls or the edges of tunics across their faces. Those with access to damp cloth might have soaked it, instinctively trying to filter the air. Eyes stung. Tears mixed with ash to create gritty paste at the corners of eyelids. For the elderly, for infants, for anyone with weak lungs or illness, these hours could already have been deadly. In some districts, movement outward still seems to have been possible for a time. Along the road leading from the Herculaneum Gate, for example, archaeologists have found groups of people together with their possessions, jewellery, coins, tools, even keys. Keys are a poignant detail. They suggest that when some householders left, they locked up first, or at least took with them the means to return. That is the mindset of someone escaping a temporary crisis, not someone fleeing the permanent end of a city. Farther from the centre, outside the walls, bodies appear in ditches and along field paths. Some carry sacks of valuables. Others seem to have fled with almost nothing. The pattern suggests that many did manage to get out of the urban core in those early hours, spreading into the countryside in the belief that open ground would be safer than stone streets that channeled debris. Not everyone could even attempt that journey. Slaves, tied by obligation or by chains, may have been kept inside to guard property, or sent on dangerous errands back and forth across town. Shopkeepers might have hesitated to abandon goods that represented their entire livelihood. The sick and the infirm depended on relatives who had to balance compassion against the pull of survival. Some people stayed because they could not move. Others stayed because, in that half-knowledge, they believed they must not move. Within houses, choices narrowed as time passed. Pumice piled in courtyards, first as an ankle-deep nuisance, then a knee-high impediment, then a mass that pressed against doorways and flowed into rooms whenever shutters opened. Light roofs over garden peristyles buckled under the growing weight. In several houses, upper stories collapsed into the spaces below, crushing those who had sheltered in interior rooms they thought safest. Archaeologists can read this in the layers: beams angled downward, tiles scattered over skeletons, voids in the pumice where bodies once lay before moisture and time dissolved them. The distribution tells of ceilings coming down selectively, first over the weakest spans, then progressively over stronger ones as the fall continued. Streets, meanwhile, turned into strange shifting channels. As pumice built up, walking changed character entirely. Instead of firm stone underfoot, there was a loose, unstable surface that slid and rolled. Steps had to be lifted higher, legs working harder with each motion. For those carrying children or bundles, fatigue would have come quickly. An able-bodied adult might still make steady progress. A group trying to keep together, taking turns to help the slowest, the oldest, the most frightened, would have moved much more slowly. At the same time, structures along those routes were failing. Porticos that lined some of the main streets shed roof tiles and wooden beams. In narrow alleys, falling debris had nowhere to go but down onto whoever happened to be passing at that moment. A choice made minutes earlier to take the familiar shortcut or the broader main road could mean the difference between reaching a gate and being trapped in a collapsing corridor. From the pattern of remains, it seems that some city gates saw heavy use. Others, especially those facing more directly toward the mountain, may have been less crowded. People likely tried to move away from the source of the fall, relying on instinct and what they could see of the column's lean and the direction of the heaviest rain of stones. But the sky offered no reassuring gradient, no clear edge to escape beyond. The ash spread wide. The pumice fall extended for kilometres. There was no obvious place where someone in Pompeii could look up and say, "If I get just that far, I will be safe." So the hours passed in a kind of suspended emergency. Inside, families tested roofs with poles, listening for ominous cracks. Outside, streams of refugees struggled through deepening layers of stone, turning back when the effort became too great or when falling masonry blocked the way. Some moved from house to house, seeking stronger shelter, trading the exposed danger of the streets for whatever seemed, for the moment, more solid. We do not know exactly how many left in time. The archaeological record is biased toward those who did not. The survivors, however many there were, took their stories with them into other towns along the bay, into the written accounts that never reached us, into the memories that died decades later. What we have instead are paths half traced in bone and stone, a family that almost made it to the gate, a group that chose the road to the coast, a cluster that stayed in a cellar until the ceiling fell. Later, Vesuvius would change tactics. The long rain of pumice would give way to something faster, hotter, and far more final. But in these first hours the disaster still unfolded at human speed. There was time to hesitate, to argue, to comfort, to misjudge. Time to believe that this was a storm like others, that roofs would hold, that the mountain would tire and go back to sleep. It was in that interval, in those hours of confusion and escape, that the fate of thousands was quietly decided. And then, almost without warning, the nature of the eruption changed. For most of that first day, Vesuvius had behaved like a vast, terrible fountain. Gas and ash and pumice were driven high into the sky, then drifted back down over the landscape. It was deadly, but slow enough that people could move within it, make decisions, stumble from one shelter to another. Sometime in the later hours, the great column that had been rising above the mountain began to falter. Volcanologists today think of these eruptions as a contest between upward force and gravity. As long as the hot gas and ash streaming from the vent are light enough, they soar upward in a towering plume. But if too much dense material accumulates, or if the supply of gas shifts, that towering column can no longer support its own weight. Parts of it lose buoyancy. They begin to fall back, not as loose drifting ash, but as a dense rolling cloud. That is the beginning of a pyroclastic surge. A surge is not like the slow fall of pumice that had been burying Pompeii. It is a ground-hugging avalanche of superheated gas, ash, and tiny rock fragments. Imagine a cloud that behaves like a flood, pouring down slopes, flowing around obstacles, racing along valleys and across plains. Temperatures can rise to hundreds of degrees Celsius. The air within it is thick with choking particles. It moves fast, tens, sometimes over 100 kilometers an hour. There is no outrunning such a thing on foot. There is no door thick enough, no cellar deep enough to make it harmless. Where the earlier phases of the eruption had offered choices, a pyroclastic surge offered almost none. Modern reconstruction suggests that Vesuvius produced a series of these surges and flows during its final, most destructive phase. Some stayed close to the cone, pouring down one side of the volcano and sparing distant slopes. Others spread more widely. A few reached far enough to sweep across the plains where Pompeii lay. The people still in the city when that first lethal surge arrived would probably not have seen it clearly. By then, daylight was already dim, the air thick with ash. There may have been a deepening of the roar, a sudden rush of hotter wind. Some may have heard a new advancing sound, a low, rolling thunder that did not fade. Then the cloud was there. The crucial thing about a pyroclastic surge is that it kills primarily through heat and suffocation, not by burying bodies under heavy blocks. The temperature of the gas can be so high that exposed skin burns in an instant, that clothing ignites or shrivels, that the air in the lungs sears with a single breath. At the same time, the particles suspended in that gas make it effectively impossible to breathe. Within seconds, consciousness flickers and goes out. In Pompeii, many of the victims from this final phase appear to have died exactly that way, caught in whatever posture they happened to hold at the moment the surge enveloped them. Some lie with arms raised, as if trying to shield faces. Others curl instinctively, knees drawn up, hands close to their bodies. A few are still in positions of motion, stumbling, reaching, turning. The ash and fine pumice carried in the surge settled rapidly over these bodies, creating a blanket that thickened with each additional wave from the mountain. Over hours, and in some places perhaps mere minutes, the layers built up, hot, then cooling, then being buried by the next deposit. In nearby Herculaneum, closer to Vesuvius, and directly in the path of some of the densest flows, the process unfolded differently. There, what raced down the slope was not a relatively dilute surge, but something heavier. Pyroclastic flows loaded with ash and rock that behaved almost like a fluid mass. They hit the town with greater heat and weight, filling lower levels, burying ground floors in a single overwhelming moment. The people sheltering in the boat houses by the shore seemed to have died nearly instantaneously from extreme heat, their bodies then encased as the glowing deposits cooled and solidified. Pompeii, a little farther away, and on a slightly different line, seems to have received surges that were still catastrophic but somewhat less dense. They swept through open streets and courtyards, curling around corners, pushing into doorways and windows, but not always filling every space with solid material at once. That is why, in some Pompeian houses, you find upper rooms still partly open to the sky above thick ash layers, while the same eruption locked Herculaneum into a harder, more compacted tomb. Yet in both towns the end result was similar. Bodies, buildings, and objects were sealed within a rapidly accumulating archive of volcanic material. For those who died in Pompeii's final surges, the ash became both shroud and preservative. As the bodies decayed over the following months and years, the spaces they once occupied remained as voids in the compacted ash. Centuries later, when excavators discovered these hollow forms, they realized they could fill them with plaster, capturing in eerie detail the positions and shapes of the people inside at the instant of death. It is important to remember that in 79 AD, no one could have imagined such a future. To those experiencing it, the enclosing ash was simply an end. Inside the city, roofs failed under the combined weight of earlier pumice and later ash. Wooden beams burned or were roasted to charcoal, leaving outlines embedded in the hardened deposits. Walls were scoured on the side facing the incoming surge and relatively untouched on the lee side, creating a silent record of the flow's direction. Garden beds with their soil and roots were overrun and flattened, but the seeds and pollen trapped within would wait for modern analysis to tell of the plants once growing there. Every object left behind became part of this compressed moment. Cooking pots still on hearths were encased where they stood. Bronze lamps, tools, and coins fell from hands that could no longer hold them and sank into the soft, hot ash, there to cool and be fixed in place. Wooden furniture, shutters, and doors burned away or decayed over time, but their forms remained as faint impressions, sometimes recoverable by careful excavation. Layer by layer, the city's final hours were locked away. Above the surged deposits, later falls of ash and loose material continued to blanket the area, smoothing the once articulated landscape into a featureless swell. Rainwater percolated through the new ground, cementing some layers, eroding tiny channels through others. Vegetation slowly returned. Roots pushed down into ash, anchoring new soil. To someone walking across the area a century or two later, there may have been no visible sign that an entire Roman town lay entombed beneath their feet. This scale of loss is difficult to comprehend in human terms, because the ash did not just cover bodies, it covered relationships, routines, plans for the next market day, disputes half resolved, letters never sent. A whole community's present tense was interrupted and sealed, and yet from the mountain's perspective, this was only one episode in a longer life of eruptions and quiet. The same processes that ended thousands of lives in a single night also created the conditions that would later preserve those lives for us to study. Heat and ash, surge and flow, destruction and conservation bound together in the same event. When the final surges died away and the air slowly began to clear, there was no one left inside Pompeii to watch the last rumbles fade. The city had been transformed into a silent volume of layered stone and ash, its streets and houses suspended in the moment the disaster became unsurvivable. Across the bay, where the ash fell thinner and the surges did not reach, there were people who watched Vesuvius remake the coastline and tried to make sense of it. One of them was a Roman admiral and encyclopedist in his 50s, a man who had spent his life gathering facts about the natural world and arranging them into an ordered book. His name was Gaius Plinius Secundus, Pliny the Elder. He was stationed at Misenum, at the northern edge of the Bay of Naples, in command of the imperial fleet. From there, as the eruption began, he could see the strange column of smoke and ash rising over the mountain. It caught his attention not just as a danger, but as a phenomenon, something to be observed, compared, classified. Pliny's nephew, Pliny the Younger, would later describe this moment in a pair of letters. According to him, his uncle first treated the eruption as a scientific opportunity. He called for his scribes and ordered a small boat made ready so he could get closer and see it more clearly. He noted the shape of the cloud, tall, rising straight up like the trunk of a pine tree before spreading into branches at the top. That pine tree comparison has passed into every modern account. It is one of the most vivid single images we have of the eruption, as it looked from a safe distance. But the trip did not remain a scientific excursion for long. As the fleet began to prepare, a message arrived from across the bay. A friend of Pliny's, a woman named Rectina, lived near the foot of Vesuvius. From her house, or perhaps from a nearby port, she sent a desperate plea for help. The roads were already blocked by falling pumice and ash. The sea was her only hope of escape. The admiral's plan changed at once. What had begun as a voyage for observation became a rescue mission. He ordered out larger ships, triremes capable of carrying many passengers. He took his place on deck, giving commands. The fleet moved out from Misenum and crossed the bay toward the darkening shore, steering into waters already filling with floating stone and ash. It is worth pausing here to imagine his position. He was a man of high rank, in a society that prided itself on rational control, sailing toward something no Roman had ever seen. The mountain was still erupting. The sky was darkening. Pumice was falling into the sea. Yet he continued, trying to reach settlements now enveloped in smoke. The ships could not land everywhere they tried. Volcanic debris and retreating water made some shores inaccessible. At one point, Pliny's helmsman, looking toward a stretch where burning stones and ash were raining down, reportedly urged him to turn back. The admiral refused. "Fortune favours the brave," he is said to have replied, and ordered the ship onward. Eventually he managed to put in at Stabia, south of Pompeii, where another friend, Pomponianus, was staying. There, according to the Younger's account, Pliny tried to calm his hosts. He bathed, he ate, he lay down to sleep, or at least to rest, insisting that courage could be maintained by behaving as if nothing were truly extraordinary. Outside, the situation worsened. Ashfall grew heavier. Earth tremors shook the buildings. The sea withdrew from the shore as if pulled away by some vast invisible force. At dawn, or what passed for dawn under a choked sky, they decided to flee inland. Pliny did not make it far. The sky rained ash and pumice thick enough to threaten suffocation. The group tied pillows over their heads as makeshift helmets against falling fragments. Somewhere on that retreat, on the flat ground near the shore, the admiral sat down on a discarded cloth and could go no farther. His companions reported that he struggled to stand, that he complained of the sulphurous fumes. He collapsed there and died. Later writers would say he was killed by poisonous gases. Pliny the Younger, more cautious, blamed his uncle's weak lungs and bulk, suggesting that the smoke and heat were simply more than his body could handle. Modern commentators sometimes suspect a heart attack or stroke triggered by stress and exertion. In any case, his body was found later, intact, lying as if asleep. In Misenum, meanwhile, the younger Pliny stayed behind with his mother. He watched the eruption from across the bay, feeling the tremors, seeing the darkening sky, breathing the fine ash that drifted even there. Years later, when a prominent historian asked him for an account of what had happened, he wrote 2 carefully composed letters. Those letters are our main literary window into the disaster. They are more than simple reports. Pliny the Younger was writing decades after the event, as an established senator and man of letters. He framed his narrative in ways that suited Roman taste. He praised his uncle's courage and curiosity. He highlighted details that made the story vivid. He arranged observations into a sequence that would be clear and compelling to his reader. At the same time, there are moments of striking precision. He noted how the cloud over Vesuvius changed colour, from white to mottled to dark depending on the mixture of ash and gas. He described how the ashfall intensified, how the air thickened until people began to panic, believing the world was ending. He recalled seeing the sea withdraw, leaving fish stranded on the exposed seabed, a phenomenon we now associate with large-scale displacement of water during major events. He reported the repeated earth tremors, strong enough to overturn furniture and engender real fear. He told of people wandering with pillows bound to their heads, of others praying, of some shrieking, of yet others lifting their hands to the gods, uncertain which gods to invoke for a calamity that had no familiar name. What he did not offer was an explanation. For Pliny and his contemporaries, natural philosophy and religious thought were intertwined. They had categories for storms, earthquakes, comets. They had stories of mountains that burned, but Vesuvius itself had been quiet for living memory. Many probably regarded it as a benign landmark, not an active volcano. The Younger noted that some people in the crowd interpreted the darkness as a sign of cosmic collapse, a final night that would shut down the world. Others thought the disasters were local, a punishment or omen. There are no hints of plate tectonics, no understanding of magma chambers or gas pressure. Even Pliny's uncle, who had compiled an enormous encyclopedia of natural phenomena, went to the mountain as if to investigate a curiosity, not flee from a known class of hazard. This mixture of acute observation and profound misunderstanding is part of what makes the Plinian testimony so valuable. It shows us what an educated Roman could see and describe, and where even the sharpest mind of the time reached the limits of what its culture could explain. After their exchange, the historian who requested the letters, Tacitus, seems to have preserved them. They were copied and recopied as part of Pliny's collected correspondence, moving through late antiquity, the Middle Ages, and into the Renaissance. Latin scholars, monastic scribes, and later humanists read them, not because they were about volcanology, but because they were examples of elegant style, personal narrative, and moral character. In this way, the eruption's memory passed from generation to generation as literature, long before archaeologists began to dig into the buried towns themselves. When modern scholars read Pliny's letters today, they do so with 2 minds. On one hand, they treat them as eyewitness testimony, direct impressions from someone who felt the ash and saw the sky. On the other hand, they read them as crafted texts, shaped by genre expectations, by the desire to honour an uncle, by the need to turn raw experience into something that could be read aloud in a Roman salon. Placed alongside the archaeological record, the letters become one strand in a wider braid. The layers of pumice and ash, the collapsed roofs, the positions of bodies, the chemical signatures of deposits, these tell us about timelines, temperatures, and the physical reach of surges and flows. Pliny's narrative tells us about fear, confusion, attempted bravery, and the stories people told themselves in the midst of uncertainty. Neither line of evidence is complete on its own. Archaeology can show us that a wave of heat killed people in an instant, that deposits came in distinct pulses, that certain streets filled faster than others. the letters can tell us that, on the far shore, the sky grew so dark at midday that people could not recognize one another, that children clung to parents, that some believed it was the last day of the world. Together they bring the event closer without fully dissolving its strangeness. For a long time, the written account floated free of the buried city, a dramatic story anchored only by general geography. Only when excavations at Pompeii and Herculaneum advanced, and geologists began to understand volcanic processes, did the term Plinian eruption emerge, a modern label honouring the man who tried to observe and help, and the nephew who turned catastrophe into narrative. It is one of the quiet ironies of this history that the same eruption that ended Pliny the Elder's life ensured his name would be attached to a whole class of volcanic behaviour. His death near Sturbii, his decision to sail into danger, and his nephew's careful writing all became part of the way we now talk about volcanoes. And yet, for the people buried under Vesuvius's ash, no letter could change what had already happened. The Roman view, preserved in words, lets us hear voices that would otherwise be silent. The excavated streets and houses preserved in ash let us see lives that would otherwise be invisible. To understand Pompeii's end, we need both, the human testimony and the stubborn, mute evidence locked in the ground. In the centuries that followed, the letters would continue to be copied, even as the exact location of the buried towns was forgotten. Above the sealed city, new fields and villages took root. Below, the layers of ash held their story, waiting for spades and shovels, for careful brushes and sieves, to join Pliny's words with the physical traces of the day that had given those words their power. When the ash finally settled and the surges cooled, Vesuvius had not only killed a city, it had rearranged a landscape. In the immediate aftermath, there were survivors all around the bay, in Naples, in Nuceria, in the inland towns that had felt the tremors but not the lethal heat. Some had fled from the outskirts of Pompeii, or from nearby farms in time. For them the first task was not memory, it was survival. The imperial administration, slow but not absent, seems to have taken notice. Inscriptions and later sources hint at relief measures, tax remissions, attempts to support displaced people. Nearby towns absorbed refugees. Some would have told stories, over and over, of the day the mountain blew apart and a familiar place vanished into choking darkness. But Pompeii itself did not become a shrine. The city lay under meters of pumice and ash. Roofs collapsed, streets filled, doors sealed. Herculaneum was even more completely entombed under a hardened mass of volcanic mud and debris. From a distance, the slopes that had held bustling towns now looked like part of the mountain. A scarred, pale, uneven surface, gradually colonized by grasses and shrubs. Roman engineers were practical. They repaired roads where they could, diverted them where they could not. The great coastal road that had once passed near Pompeii may have shifted its line slightly to skirt unstable ground. Travellers riding along the Bay of Naples in the 2nd century would still have seen Vesuvius rising above the water. But the buried city at its foot was no longer part of anyone's daily geography. There is some evidence that people returned to pick through what remained accessible. Legal texts centuries later mention issues around property lost in eruptions, and archaeologists have found signs of post-eruption activity on the fringes of the site. Tunnels, walls cut into, objects disturbed. Perhaps local landowners tried to recover valuables from rural villas. Perhaps soldiers or labourers dug for stone and metal. These were not organised excavations. They were scavenging expeditions into a dangerous, unstable terrain. Tunnels collapsed. Toxic pockets lingered. At some point, effort stopped being worth the risk. Fields and vineyards crept closer to the edge of the buried zone and then gradually onto it. Within a generation or two, children could grow up in the region knowing that once there was a town here, without ever seeing a street or a wall. The memory of the disaster itself persisted. Roman writers in the decades after 79 mention the eruption and the destruction of towns along the bay. Martial, the epigrammatist, refers to a place which once was wealthy Pompeii. Later encyclopedists and geographers echo the fact that a flourishing city had been lost. Vesuvius's violence entered the repertoire of moral examples, a reminder of fortune's instability. But the precise physical location began to blur. Toponyms, the names of places, are surprisingly fragile. They anchor stories to the land, but they're carried in human mouths, and humans move, forget, and die. After the eruption, land ownership shifted. Fields were reparcelled, estates were founded with new names honouring new patrons. A farm might be called by its current owner's family rather than by an old municipal label. A road that once led to Pompeii might, in time, simply be the road to the vineyards or the way to the south. Maps in the modern sense were rare and limited. Most geographical knowledge was held in mental images, in travel routines, in directions like turn left at the old oak, or follow the ridge until you see the shrine. When the fixed urban landmarks vanished under ash, the web of references that had converged on them loosened. Imagine someone in the 3rd century asking an old man on the coast, "Where was Pompeii?" The answer might be a wave of the hand toward Vesuvius, or toward a particular slope where nothing obvious remained. The story of a lost city would still be there. The exact coordinates would not. Over the longer span, as the Roman Empire shifted, fragmented, and reassembled in new forms, attention moved elsewhere. Germanic kingdoms rose in the west. Constantinople thrived in the east. Trade networks altered. The Bay of Naples remained inhabited and cultivated, but it was no longer the same centre of elite leisure it had been in the 1st century. Texts survived in libraries and scriptoria far from the mountain. Pliny's letters, copied in monasteries north of the Alps, still spoke of a terrifying eruption, of the death of his uncle, of darkness at noon. Medieval readers could follow every line of his narrative without being able to point to the buried city on a map. The literary memory floated free of the land that had generated it. Local knowledge evolved along a different path. Farmers ploughing fields encountered occasional blocks of worked stone, bits of mosaic, fragments of pottery. Wells and cellars sometimes broke into older voids. Legends arose of underground structures, of cities below, of treasures hidden in the earth. In some places, carved marble or brick might be reused in churches or houses. Place names such as Civita, simply meaning the city, attached themselves to low rises that concealed ancient ruins. These were not clear, continuous recollections of Pompeii as Pompeii. They were fragments, a story about an underground chamber here, a tale of collapsed tunnels there, a rumour that a noble once found a statue while digging. Over centuries such fragments accumulate but do not necessarily assemble into a coherent picture. Each generation inherits hints, not a map. When modern scholars say that Pompeii was lost for about 1,500 years, they are describing this long disconnect between the historical city as a known, located place and the broken, scattered ways in which its existence persisted. Lost does not mean that every human in the region forgot that a town had once stood near Vesuvius. It means that the continuous thread tying name, stories, and exact physical site together was severed. From roughly the late Roman period until early modern excavations in the 18th century, no one could walk to a cluster of mounded fields and say with certainty, "Here is Pompeii. These buried streets match this name in this ancient text." Travellers passed over it without realizing. Farmers planted vines where atriums and bathhouses slept below. The city existed in 3 imperfect forms, in Latin descriptions far away, in local legends that did not use its old name, and in the mute, sealed remains below ground. In this sense, Pompeii was both erased and preserved. Erased from administrative charts, from active road systems, from the living consciousness of urban space. Preserved in ash so perfectly that, when digging finally began in earnest, wall painting still shone with colour, and the ruts of wagon wheels still mark the paving stones. The phrase, "lost for 1,500 years," compresses this entire process into a single line. It marks the span between burial in 79 and the point at which archaeologists and antiquarians could once again stand on a cleared street, match inscriptions to ancient references, and say, this is the city the texts were talking about. Between those endpoints lies a quieter history, of fields laid out over forgotten rooms, of names shifting with each new owner, of stories loosening from their original anchors and drifting into legend. While the ash-sealed houses and bodies in place, time dissolved the links in human memory that would have kept the city's identity fixed on the surface. What remained, waiting just beneath the soil, was a kind of suspended present, intact, detailed, and inaccessible until curiosity, chance, and changing attitudes toward the past converged to uncover it again. The convergence began, as such things often do, with an accident. In the early 16th century, workmen digging near the river Sarno uncovered bits of carved marble and inscriptions. Humanists in nearby towns steeped in Latin texts were curious. Some suspected that an ancient settlement lay under the fields called Civita, but the identification was vague, the evidence scattered, the tools for systematic investigation still missing. A few finds were noted, some objects were taken for gardens or private collections, and the earth closed again around the gaps. A more decisive encounter came not with Pompeii, but with its neighbour. In 1709, in the town of Resina, a well-digger sank his shaft through layers of compacted volcanic material and hit something unexpected. Marble, columns, statues, an underground theatre, as it would later turn out, belonging to the buried town of Herculaneum. News reached the local nobility, then the court of Naples. At first, the response was not archaeological in the modern sense. It was closer to mining. Tunnels were driven into the hardened tufa, following corridors, probing chambers, prying statues from the darkness. Labourers worked by torchlight, suspended in a stone honeycomb. The goal was beauty and prestige, marble sculptures to adorn palaces, bronzes to impress visitors, inscriptions to testify to the prince's connection with Rome's splendour. Yet even this treasure hunting had an unintended effect. It proved beyond any doubt that entire Roman cities could lie perfectly preserved beneath the countryside. It showed that the Bay of Naples did not just sit on rubble, it sat on time capsules. Word of the discovery circulated through Europe. Artists, antiquarians, and diplomats began to pay attention to the Kingdom of Naples, ruled then by a Bourbon dynasty eager for legitimacy and cultural capital. The buried cities offered exactly that, a direct link to imperial Rome, dramatized by their sudden reappearance. Pompeii's more systematic rediscovery emerged in this atmosphere. In 1738, royal-sponsored excavations at Herculaneum were formally begun under Charles of Bourbon, the future Charles III of Spain. 10 years later, in 1748, work expanded to another site about 8 kilometres away, on that low-rise still known locally as La Civita. The initial aim was the same: find statues, mosaics, anything worthy of a royal collection. Workers picked their way downward through soil and compacted ash. They uncovered walls, then entire rooms. They stepped into hollow spaces where the volcanic fill had been carefully removed. revealing frescoes still bright with vermilion and ochre. Coins and inscriptions began to surface, naming local magistrates, deities, and eventually the town itself. At first there was some confusion. Early reports used various labels, sometimes mixing Pompeii with nearby Stabiae, but by the mid-18th century the identity crystallized. The city under La Civita was recognized as Pompeii, the same Pompeii mentioned by Pliny and Martial, the town that had vanished in the eruption of 79. The method of exploration, however, still bore more resemblance to mining than to what we would now call excavation. At Herculaneum, the hardened volcanic matrix made open-air digging impractical, so engineers drove galleries and vertical shafts like a subterranean maze. At Pompeii, where the ash and pumice were lighter and more friable, they could clear broader areas from the surface. But the logic was still selective. Crews followed painted walls. They dug down into promising spots, emptied rooms, removed statues and portable objects, and then often backfilled or left partially cleared spaces to collapse. It was a process shaped by value, not by context. Sculptures were prized. Everyday pottery was discarded. Frescoes were sometimes detached from walls and transported to the Royal Museum in Portici, leaving bare stone behind. In the eagerness to extract, inscriptions and small finds were occasionally separated from the locations that would have given them meaning. Stratigraphy, the vertical sequence of layers that modern archaeologists read like a text, was cut through without systematic recording. Yet even this imperfect approach was revolutionary in its consequences. Visitors from across Europe, granted guided tours of the tunnels at Herculaneum or the open trenches at Pompeii, found themselves walking through ancient rooms where furniture outlines still marked the walls, where graffiti still scratched its jokes and political slogans into plaster. This was not the Rome they knew from temples and arches slowly eroding in the sun. This was domestic, intimate, almost shockingly immediate. The contrast with Herculaneum sharpened the impression. In Herculaneum's damp, airless tunnels, organic materials had survived. Wooden doors, charred scrolls in the villa later called of the papyri, even bits of food. But the experience was fragmentary, glimpsed by torchlight, mediated by narrow shafts. At Pompeii, as the Bourbon excavations widened, whole street segments emerged under the sky again. Houses could be entered, courtyards crossed. For the first time, early modern Europeans could stroll through an ancient urban fabric, not as a ruin filtered by centuries of reuse, but as a frozen moment. This exposure began to alter how educated Europeans imagined antiquity. Before, the classical world had been known mostly through texts and through monumental remains, temples, theatres, baths, the occasional statue. The everyday was largely conjectural, fleshed out by painters and writers from their own contemporary surroundings. Pompeii changed that. Here were inns with graffiti advertising food and drink, wine shops with dolia still set into their counters, modest shrines in corners of houses, public notices painted on facade walls. The effect was to democratize the ancient past. Instead of only emperors and generals, viewers saw bakers and barmaids, schoolboys and scribes. Instead of abstract virtue and vice in moralizing histories, they met the texture of daily life, shopping lists, crude jokes, personal rivalries. This intimacy seeped into art, literature and philosophy. Neoclassical painters drew not just on myth, but on actual furnishings and garments copied from Pompeian walls. Novelists spun tales set in the newly unearthed streets. The ancient world became less of an idealized stage and more of a lived place. At the same time, the manner in which the city was brought to light carried its own tensions. Curiosity and reverence coexisted with carelessness and exploitation. To reveal a fresco meant to expose it to sun, wind and tourists, all of which could degrade pigments faster than burial ever had. To remove a statue for safekeeping preserved the object but stripped the room of its original centerpiece. Treasure hunting damaged as much as it rescued. Some observers were already uneasy. Enlightenment thinkers, with their growing interest in empirical evidence and historical method, began to argue for more systematic recording. Plans were drawn, inscriptions were copied before removal. Comparisons between Pompeii and Herculaneum highlighted the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches. The open-air clarity of Pompeii allowed vistas and context, but also encouraged looting and weathering. The tunnelled secrecy of Herculaneum protected delicate materials, yet made comprehensive understanding slow and fragmentary. Slowly, out of these experiments and errors, a new sensibility emerged. The buried city was not just a quarry of art. It was a document. Each wall, each layer of ash, each cluster of household objects could tell a story, if only one resisted the urge to tear it from its setting. The same impulse that had first sent royal engineers digging for marvels now had to be restrained in the service of knowledge. By the end of the 18th century, Pompeii had become both a marvel of rediscovery and a cautionary example. It showed how much of the past could survive unseen beneath ordinary ground. It also showed how easily the act of uncovering could blur or erase the very patterns one hoped to study. That tension, between recovery and damage, between desire to possess and need to understand, would shape the next phase of the city's second life, as scholars learned not only to find Pompeii, but to read it. To read Pompeii, archaeologists first had to learn to slow down. 19th century excavators inherited a city already scarred by a century of selective digging. They also inherited new ideas. Geology was turning layers of earth into timelines, and early prehistorians were beginning to see stone tools and bones not as curiosities, but as evidence. Pompeii, lying there half cleared, invited the same shift in perspective. Instead of driving trenches toward the richest houses, some directors began to expose whole insulae, entire city blocks, street by street. Plans grew more precise. Walls were measured, room sequences traced, drainage lines followed. The city stopped being just a series of individual showpieces and started to become a system. But the real turning point came with a man who asked an almost childish question. What filled the empty spaces? Giuseppe Fiorelli, appointed director in the 1860s, inherited not only a famous site but also a problem. In many places the ash and pumice had been removed, leaving walls and floors but also odd cavities in the hardened material. Previous diggers had often ignored them or broken through them without pausing. Fiorelli wondered if those cavities were not just absences but shapes. He tried an experiment. Where workmen found a hollow in the compacted ash, he had them carefully poke a small hole and pour in liquid plaster of Paris. Once the plaster set, they chipped away the surrounding material. What emerged was not a formless lump, it was a body. You can imagine the shock. The plaster preserved the negative space left when the soft tissues of a buried person had decayed, leaving a void within the ash shell that had first formed around them. That void recorded everything the ash had touched: the curve of a back, the folds of fabric, the fingers pressed to a face. In some casts, you can see the imprint of leather sandals, the texture of a belt, even the cord of a purse. Fiorelli's method revealed that the city was full of invisible ghosts, not only humans. Plaster poured into other voids picked up the shapes of wooden doors, furniture, even roots of vines in gardens long gone. The eruption had wrapped itself around every solid form. When those forms rotted away, the ash kept their memory. Fiorelli's casts made those negative memories positive again, tangible and visual. They also changed how people thought about Pompeii. Earlier visitors had walked through abandoned rooms, imagining absent inhabitants. Now the inhabitants were quite literally there, frozen in their last moments. A child curled beside an adult, a dog twisted in its chain, a man lying face down, hand outstretched toward a bundle of keys. The casts made the disaster immediate, almost unbearably so. At the same time, they raised questions that still trouble archaeologists. Is it right to display these casts as objects of curiosity? Are they artifacts or remains? The plaster encases voids where once there were bodies. In many cases, bones still lie inside. To exhibit them is to show death, very intimate death, under glass. Some see this as a powerful reminder of mortality and history. Others worry that it risks turning tragedy into spectacle. The same tension appears in the way the city itself is treated. Removing ash reveals walls and floors, but exposure begins a new kind of destruction. Sunlight fades frescoes. Rain seeps into mortar. Tourism tramples thresholds and polishes ancient paving stones. Modern conservationists inheriting 2.5 centuries of both brilliance and carelessness now ask at every turn, how much do we uncover and how do we protect what we reveal? Within that careful balance, however, Pompeii has become something unique, a laboratory. Most ancient cities survive as palimpsests. Medieval streets cut across Roman foundations. Renaissance houses rework classical walls. Pompeii, sealed in 79, froze an entire urban organism at one moment in time. That means archaeologists can test ideas here with a precision almost impossible elsewhere. They read walls as you might read tree rings. Layers of plaster on a facade record repaints, renovations, changes in fashion. Inscriptions painted on those walls, election notices, advertisements, notices of games, can be dated by the officials they name. Where one slogan overlaps another, you can see which campaign came later, how often facades were reused as public notice boards, how political communication saturated the streets. Inside houses, frescoes speak a quieter language. Schemes of decoration, simple panels, elaborate mythological scenes, trompe-l'oeil architecture, fall into patterns that art historians call styles. These styles, refined by decades of close study at Pompeii, help date not only these rooms but wall paintings across the Roman world. A dining room with a certain kind of landscape scene can be slotted, roughly, into a chronology. Furnishings, when preserved as shadows or as Fiorelli-style casts, show how those painted spaces were used. Couches along the walls, tables in the centre, small shrines tucked into corners. Then there is the writing no one meant for posterity. Graffiti, scratched, painted, hurried, covers many surfaces. Names of lovers, tallies of games won and lost, jokes about bad bread, worse wine, or incompetent politicians, quotations of poetry, sometimes slightly mangled. These casual markings let historians hear voices usually absent from polished literature. Slaves, freedmen, shopkeepers, the bored and the boastful. At Pompeii, their words stay exactly where they were written. You can see which alley wall attracted sports fans, which courtyard became a canvas for schoolboys practicing their letters. Objects fill out the picture. Tools found in workshops tell us what trades operated where. Metal slag and anvils in one district, dye vats in another, ovens and millstones in bakeries that cluster near markets. Carbonized loaves, left in the oven on the morning of the eruption, preserve recipes and baking techniques. Amphorae still stacked in storerooms keep traces of wine, oil and fish sauce. By analyzing residues, researchers reconstruct trade routes, the vineyards that supplied a tavern, the fisheries that stocked a restaurant. Even leftovers matter. In latrines and drains, archaeobotanists and zooarchaeologists sift seeds, bones and shells. They can tell which fish were staples, which spices were luxuries, how often people ate pork versus beef, how diets varied between neighbourhoods or social ranks. Tiny grape seeds, figs, olives, and pulses form a kind of menu written not in ink but in discard. Architecture provides the frame for all of this. Street widths, sidewalk heights, the spacing of fountains and stepping stones show how people and carts moved through the city, how water was distributed, how traffic was regulated. The arrangement of shops along busy thoroughfares and quieter back streets reveals patterns of commerce. Public buildings, the forum, baths, temples, theatres, anchor civic life. Their orientation and rebuilding phases, traced stone by stone, show the slow transformation of a Samnite town into a Roman colony, and then into an imperial provincial centre. Put together, these strands let archaeologists run controlled experiments in imagination. What happens if you stand in a doorway and list everything found in that room, then in the next and the next? Patterns emerge: storage rooms behind shops, sleeping spaces above, courtyards as hubs of family activity. Compare dozens of houses, and you can map social status onto architecture: how much space, how much light, how much decoration different classes enjoyed. Compare different corners of the city, and you see micro-economies: a potter's quarter here, a cluster of taverns near the amphitheatre there. Yet with every new method, the plaster cast, the chemical assay, the digital survey, the ethical questions return. How many more cavities should be cast, knowing that the process may stress the fragile ash? How many more frescoes should be fully uncovered, knowing that exposure begins a slow countdown of decay? Should all human remains be exhibited, or should some be allowed to rest in relative privacy beneath the pumice that has sheltered them for nearly 2 millennia? Today, many teams choose restraint. They document with photography, 3D scanning, and notes before they remove anything. They sometimes rebury particularly delicate areas under protective layers. They debate how to present the casts, as art, as evidence, as memorials. Pompeii has forced archaeology to confront its own responsibilities, not just to knowledge, but to the dead and to the future. In that sense, the city is more than a source of information. It is a teacher of method. It shows how much can be learned when context is respected, when patience replaces haste, when a wall is not just a backdrop for a painting, but a record of lives lived against it. The same ash that once erased Pompeii now preserves it as a text, and archaeologists, generation after generation, are still learning how to read. Pompeii's lessons begin with something very simple and very old: the street. Walk it in your mind, from the grand colonnades of the Forum out toward the cruder districts by the walls, and you feel the gradient of class with every step. Near the centre, wide doorways open into atrium houses with marble floors, painted gardens, private shrines. Farther out, front rooms become workshops, back rooms crowd together, light grows scarce. The city shows, in stone, that Roman society was never flat. It was terraced. Yet the terraces are not cleanly separated. A luxurious house might share a wall with a bar. An elite residence might rent out its street front to a fulanica, a laundry where slaves and freedmen stomped cloth in tubs of chemicals, including human urine collected in jars on the corners. Fine frescoes stood literally next door to vats that stank. Pompeii teaches that Roman class life was intensely stratified, but also physically entangled. The rich could not insulate themselves from the labour that sustained them. They lived with it, abutted it, profited from it, and walked past it every day. Labour itself becomes visible in ways ancient texts often blur. Inscriptions give us names and sometimes wages of builders, painters, and sailors. Tools and half-finished walls show construction sites left a mid-project. Election slogans, many painted by professional signwriters, cluster in certain streets, suggesting contractors who specialized in political advertising. A single bakery might hold evidence of enslaved workers turning heavy millstones by hand, while the owner's name appears proudly on amphora stamped with his brand. The city reveals not just who worked, but how their efforts were organized, supervised, and monetized. Religion too looks different here than in polished accounts. Yes, there are temples to Jupiter, Apollo, Venus, the imperial cult. Their steps frame the forum. Their altars anchored official ritual. But smaller devotions crowd the gaps. Household shrines painted with snakes and offerings appear in kitchens and courtyards. Street corner niches hold images of local protective spirits. A backroom temple to Isis, furnished in an Egyptian style carefully adapted to Roman taste, shows how foreign cults could be woven into local practice. Pompeii's religion is not a neat pantheon, but a dense fabric of overlapping loyalties, civic, domestic, imported, improvised. Gender appears in unexpected places. Elite houses display mythological scenes in which women are often portrayed as objects of desire, patience, or tragedy. Yet graffiti records sharp female voices, women boasting of lovers, insulting rivals, or leaving practical notices. In tomb inscriptions, some women are honoured for running businesses, financing buildings, sponsoring games. In bars and brothels, sexual commerce blurs strict categories, but also exposes double standards. Sex for sale is openly depicted, yet women who operate too freely in the public sphere are mocked or policed in writing. Pompeii complicates any simple story of Roman patriarchy. Legal and cultural power skewed toward male citizens, but within that structure, women could maneuver, manage, own, and remember. The city preserves those maneuvers in property records, shop signs, and dedicatory plaques. It suggests a world in which gender was a framework, not a fixed script. Urban life itself comes across as more untidy than any marble-clad reconstruction. We see cart ruts cutting deep into paving stones, suggesting noise, congestion, and wear. We see buildings cut and recut, rooms subdivided, staircases added, courtyards roofed over. A grand house might be partly converted into a rental complex, with upper floors turned into modest apartments. Drainage channels clogged, were cleared, clogged again. Walls bear layers of posters, each new announcement only half erasing the old. Instead of a perfectly planned Roman city, Pompeii gives us a living organism, constantly adapting, improvising, and repurposing itself. It also reminds us how messy ancient morals were. Texts from Rome often praise austere virtue, civic duty, and pious restraint. At Pompeii, those ideals sit beside wall paintings of mythological seductions, explicit ensigns, and graffiti that range from tender love poems to crude insults. The same society that hosted solemn processions in the Forum also packed the amphitheatre to watch blood sports and scheduled gladiatorial games as part of religious festivals. The same city that housed a temple to Venus also smeared her name across bawdy jokes. The contradictions are not accidents, they are the texture of everyday life. Yet for all this richness, much remains uncertain. We often do not know exactly who owned a given house at the moment of the eruption. We can read names, but property changes hands, tenants move, families expand and contract. A room filled with amphorae might be storage for a shop, or a temporary hoard awaiting shipment. A set of surgical tools might belong to a physician or to a collector of bronze. The bodies themselves are difficult to read. Early interpreters tried to assign identities and stories to every cast: a loving couple, a desperate mother, a faithful slave. Modern analysis, including CT scans, reveals that some of those narratives were projections. Age, sex, health, and cause of death can be more complicated than the posture suggests. A figure thought to be female might prove to be male. A family group might be unrelated individuals who happen to flee along the same path. Even the snapshot of 79 AD can mislead. Because the city was destroyed in an instant, it is tempting to treat every object as if it were in its normal place. But people were in the midst of their day. Tools lay out because someone was working. Goods were stacked oddly because someone was reorganizing. Repairs were underway. Decorations were outdated or in transition. The eruption fossilized a moment that, like any moment, was full of movement. Archaeologists must constantly resist the urge to turn that fraction of a day into a timeless norm. Pompeii's very completeness invites overconfidence. We can count bakeries, measure bars, list brothels, and sometimes it feels as if we could reconstruct the entire social fabric. But the city is only one town in one region, with its own quirks and local tastes. It was shaped by its history as a Samnite settlement, a Roman colony, a Campanian port. To treat it as typical for all of Rome is to stretch its evidence beyond what it can bear. And yet, despite these cautions, or perhaps because of them, Pompeii continues to fascinate. It pulls modern visitors and readers back again and again, not only with its tragedy, but with its immediacy. A scratched complaint about bad wine feels strangely contemporary. A love note carved into a wall looks like something you might see on a modern desk or bus stop. The combination of familiarity and distance, of shared human habits under utterly different conditions, creates a powerful sense of connection across time. There is also the allure of the unfinished puzzle. Every season, new techniques extract new data. Pigments analysed, residues tested, voids scanned without filling. Each finding adjusts the picture slightly, reminding us that the past is not a fixed story, but an ongoing conversation. Pompeii stands at the centre of that conversation, both generous in what it yields and stubborn in what it withholds. Above all, the city teaches a quiet lesson about scale. An entire urban world, its classes and conflicts, its faith and entertainments, its loves and arguments, could be snuffed out in less than 2 days and then hidden for centuries. What feels solid and permanent from the inside can, in retrospect, look very fragile. Yet that same fragility made preservation possible. Ash that destroyed also sealed. Forgetting that seemed like loss has, in the long span, become a kind of memory. As we leave Pompeii's streets in our imagination, that is the thought that lingers. The lives lived there were ordinary to the people who lived them. Commutes and chores, prayers and quarrels, routines and small joys. Vesuvius turned those routines into a record none of them intended to leave. In the calm that follows, we're left with a city that still whispers about class and labour, belief and desire, order and chaos, and about how quickly all of it can change. When we think back over Pompeii's story, it can feel impossibly large. An entire city erased, a whole community sealed under ash. But what the ash actually ended were thousands of very small, very ordinary timelines. A baker worried about tomorrow's flour delivery, a girl practicing her letters on a wax tablet, annoyed at a difficult word, a tenant wondering if the rent would go up when the repairs were finally finished. None of them imagined that their half-finished chores and half-spoken plans would become the way future generations knew them at all. The eruption drew a single hard line through all of those lives. Before there was noise, bargaining, gossip, smoking ovens, splashing fountains. After there was only silence, darkness, and settling dust. Yet that same ash that stopped the stories also trapped their traces so completely that when the city was uncovered, the past felt almost ready to start moving again. Across this series, we've followed that arc. First, a thriving Campanian town, folded into the Roman world, its streets crowded with traders, sailors, labourers, elites. Then, the day the mountain woke, the hours of confusion and flight, the final surge that turned people into hollow spaces in the hardened ash. Then, centuries of absence, when Pompeii existed only as a memory in old texts and local legends, if at all. Finally, the long, careful unburying, the moment when a worker's spade struck painted plaster, when walls, floors and objects rose back into the light. What had been a catastrophe became a site of inquiry. A lost neighbourhood turned into one of the clearest windows we have onto everyday Roman life. Part of why Pompeii feels so close is that its remains are not abstract. They are not just dates, dynasties or laws. They are front rooms with counters still darkened by wine, staircases worn down on one side by habitual feet, slogans that sound like last year's political arguments. They are shopping lists, jokes, hearts scratched next to names. Walk through it in your mind and the rhythms are recognizable. Wake, work, eat, talk, desire, worship, worry, rest. The buildings are Roman, the language Latin, the gods many, but the pattern of days is not so foreign. Pompeii shrinks the distance between them and us until it becomes thin enough to see through. As you drift towards sleep, you might let that thought settle. An entire city, once louder than its own volcano, now rests in a kind of suspended twilight between ruin and reconstruction. Its streets will never bustle again in the way they did, but they continue to carry meaning. Archaeologists add new layers of interpretation. Visitors add new layers of response. The city, though buried, keeps working on the people who encounter it. If you've enjoyed wandering these ash-covered streets in your imagination, you might gently tap like, or leave a comment, or subscribe so you can find your way back to other quiet journeys into the past. I'd also be curious to know where you're listening from tonight. A modern city apartment, a small town, a distant countryside. Each place adds its own context to the story of this older city, sleeping under an Italian hill. And if this kind of slow, deep history helps you think or helps you rest, you may be interested in exploring further. There is a book about prehistoric secrets and long-buried human stories that you can read more about, and, if you like, purchase at sleepytimehistory.com. It follows different eras and different disasters, but it shares the same gentle curiosity about how lives leave traces and how those traces are found. For now, Pompeii lies quiet again in your mind, the ashes settled, the streets empty. Only the outline of the city remains, held softly in memory, waiting until you choose to visit it once more.